Welcome to Humanities West and the Commonwealth Club. This is, I think, our 13th program that we've done since we started doing them at the Commonwealth Club during the beginning of the pandemic. And tonight's program is on the 50th anniversary of the end of the Vietnam War, called Lessons Unlearned. I think that's very important to me personally and to many people my age. I think one of the things that's important to understand for people that were teenagers or young adults in the 1960s is that, say, in 1968, it was 50 years since the end of World War I, right? 50 years since the end of World War I. World War I seemed like forever ago. And I think it's important for us to understand that teenagers today, the Vietnam War is just as far back as World War I was for us. And I know that sounds weird, but I think that that's a very useful thing for trying to understand, can we learn something? Can we learn something from World War I? Can we learn something from Vietnam? What we did and what we didn't do. But one of the personal things for me is that in February of 1972, the draft lottery was up, and I was in that draft lottery. And I was in college, freshman year. And my roommates and I had two roommates. We didn't do very well in the lottery. There are three of us, and together our draft numbers added up to 50. One was my roommate, Randy Viola, who had 37 in the draft. And I've known him since third grade, actually. We ended up going to the same school in New Hampshire from Wisconsin, so we roomed. And then we had a third roommate from Virginia, Barry Holler, and he got 12 in the draft. Now, who's quick at math? Yeah, I won the draft lottery. So I got number one. And the funny thing about that is, I figure you can only win one lottery per life. So I have never played the lottery ever since, because I figure my luck is already out. So the war was combined with politics, of course, at the time. And all through 1973, when I was up for the draft, President Nixon was fighting the perception that maybe he had lied about Watergate and thinking that he probably had to keep people on his side. And although I was up every month to get drafted, the whole year went by very, very slowly, by the way. And at the end of the year, he had not drafted anybody in that year at all. Now, a classmate of mine who was born in the room in St. Catherine's Hospital in Kenosha, Wisconsin, right next to mine, on the same day, Jim Gifford. He, of course, had the same birthday as mine, was number one in the draft, and he volunteered in order to get the place that he wanted. And he ended up having a very good career in the military for his whole life and has retired fairly recently. And I think about my classmate and the fact that we started in adjacent rooms as babies, and that we have very different trajectories in our lives and everything. But the war is a personal thing for everybody. And all politics is a personal thing for everybody on the personal level in which we experience it. And of course, it would be nice if politicians ever thought of that. But I do think one of the reasons that I'm so interested in this subject, besides all that personal reason, is that we try to learn from history. I know a lot of people don't try to learn from history, think that happened a long time ago, it's different, But we, in spite of the fact that things are different, we can learn. That's why I called it Lessons Unlearned. And the programs that we have are tonight and Friday night. For those of you who aren't aware, on Friday night we have three more speakers coming. We have three speakers tonight. The three speakers tonight are basically historians looking at it from different points of view, at the war from different points of view. And then I call it the practitioners on Friday. The first speaker is a teacher, but he teaches at the U.S. Naval War College, and he's going to tell us what they teach the young officers at the U.S. Naval War College about what we should learn from Vietnam. So we're going to learn that. Then we have Tom Berner, who is going to be speaking about Afghanistan, what we didn't learn when we went to Afghanistan. He worked there for 2 years after 9/11, volunteered to go to try to help construct with U.S. aid, which has been in the news a lot lately, in order to try to construct a civil society in Afghanistan after we went in there. And our third speaker is Layli Heslop, who was born in North Vietnam, and as a child was there at the beginning of the war and has eventually came to the United States and has been part of the peace effort between Vietnam and the reconciliation and the United States ever since. So those are our speakers to try to give a different point of view, and I'm interested in making sure that everybody sees how many points of view make sense. It's important when we're dealing with each other in a democracy to think that the other people who have a different point of view, it makes sense to them. Now, none of our ideas make total sense, obviously. So I mean, at least it seems like that. So if you have an idea that makes 90% sense to you and the other person has something that makes 90% sense to them, you might find some common ground. But that's how we get along, obviously, right? That's how we compromise in a democracy instead of just letting one man make all the decisions. And yeah, I'm talking historically. So I think it's important because we have a common ground. And we know that 60 to 70% of the population sits in that common ground, but there's not a lot of politicians in the common ground area. So it's important for us to learn. A lot of people speak about our parents' generations, or for some of you who are younger, your grandparents' generation, as the greatest generation, the one that created the bounties of the 50s and the 60s in America and throughout the world. And I think it's important to remember that they were just like us, except for they had gone through so many terrible experiences, just being born at the end of World War I probably, and then the Depression, and then World War II, that they knew things could get worse. And if you know things can get worse, you compromise. It's that simple. Now, I hope we don't have to go to the point where we know things can get worse before we can compromise. But it would be useful to learn a few things. So every once in a while we do programs where we're trying to learn something from what went before. And this is one of them. And this maxim that I wrote many, many years ago had nothing to do with the Vietnam War, but it's very applicable. It is that resorting to lying and cheating always amounts to an admission of defeat. And if you're in any competition and you have to resort to lying and cheating, you've already admitted to yourself that you can't win playing by the rules, right? And if everybody would just understand that, I think it would be a lot more embarrassing to lie and cheat all the time, right? Because you're saying that you don't have the confidence to play the game the way the rules are. So we have 3 speakers here tonight. We have Mark Lawrence, who teaches at the University of Texas, Austin. He used to run the LBJ Presidential Library. He's written 3 books on the Vietnam War, and like one of the top scholars on what's going on with the history from the Vietnam War. And we have Elizabeth Cobbs, who teaches at San Diego State University. She's an author of many books, but she has a book called American Empire, which I did a program with her here years ago. And I wanted to bring her back and get that perspective, because she has this idea about are we an umpire in the world, or are we the policeman, basically? And there are 2 different roles that we can play. And then we have Yale Ferguson, who is at Rutgers University, and he has written a lot on big issues in war, on a large number of issues, and I happen to know him, and I thought that would be a great ending to our program today. So we'll have a Q&A, and we've left a little more time than usual for Q&A because this is a subject that should provoke all kinds of questions. So, Mark Lawrence first. Mark.
Well, thank you so much, George. Thank you for the wonderful invitation to be here tonight and for that great introduction. Thank you all for being here on what is, after all, a historic day. 50 years since April 30th, 1975, when, of course, the North Vietnamese tanks crashed through the gates of the presidential palace in Saigon and put a definitive end to the American war in Vietnam. But I want to suggest the starting point for my remarks tonight is that a different sort of war began on that very day. This was a struggle to shape the meaning of America's lost war in Vietnam, to learn lessons, and to figure out how to apply those lessons in a way that would presumably help avoid future traumas like the one that had unfolded in Vietnam. So it's that fight, that war after the war, that I'd like to address with you a little bit this evening. These cartoons from 2021 suggest, it seems to me, that Vietnam retains a lot of the power in our own times as a reference point for new controversies that come along in American foreign relations, and that the fight over the war's meaning will probably go on for a long time to come. But with half a century now to reflect upon, we are, I think, in a pretty good position to try to make sense of where we've been in our collective effort to understand the implications of America's war in Vietnam. And mostly what I'd like to accomplish in my time this evening is to impose some order on what may strike us at first as a somewhat muddled, cacophonous, even sometimes angry story of discord over the war's fundamental meaning. And to be sure, there's broad agreement, I think, even a kind of cliche, that the Vietnam War created profound divisions in our society. But we all too rarely, I think, stop to ask what this sort of claim really means. What precisely do we disagree about? Why has this disagreement persisted so long and inspired such passions over the years? Now, without a doubt, historians, memoirists, journalists, pundits, even novelists, songwriters have differed on any number of very specific points connected to the 30-year-long American experience in Vietnam. And of course, how could it be otherwise with an experience that lasted over 3 decades and touched realms of American life ranging from art and culture to military affairs, foreign policy, party politics, and so forth. But what I'd like to do is fly at a somewhat higher altitude and to suggest that much of the discord surrounding the Vietnam War's principal lessons swirls around a single fundamental question. And this question is, why did the United States fail to achieve its objectives in Vietnam? How, to put it differently, did the world's mightiest power fail to secure the stable anti-communist South Vietnam that commanded the support of its own people and possessed the ability to defend itself, the core goal that the United States pursued for a long time? So to get us started, I'd like to take you back to January of and here's a slide merely meant to illustrate that this effort to understand Vietnam's implications and how it, what lessons it holds for later periods has been around for a long time. But I'd like to get us really rolling tonight by taking you back to January 2007. This was a time, as you may recall, of pretty bitter fighting in Iraq. This was one day before President Bush was to announce his quite controversial plan at that time to send an additional 20,000 American troops to shore up the faltering military commitment in Iraq. Addressing an audience at the National Press Club, Senator Ted Kennedy staunchly opposed this so-called surge in words that were bound to make headlines. Iraq, said Kennedy, is George Bush's Vietnam. Kennedy insisted that just like Lyndon Johnson 40 years earlier, Bush was responding to frustration by doubling down on a failed enterprise. In Vietnam, he said, the White House grew increasingly obsessed with victory and increasingly divorced from the will of the people and any rational policy. In fact, he continued, and this is really the core of it, I think, there was no military solution in Vietnam. But we kept trying to find one anyway. In the end, 58,000 Americans died in the search for it. The echoes of that disaster are all around us today. Well, 7 months later, President Bush responded in kind, confident that the surge was in fact bringing favorable results in Iraq, Bush drew every bit as assertively on the history of the Vietnam War in making the case that the United States must stick with its military effort in Iraq, no matter how painful that experience was. Bush's audience was the annual convention of the veterans of foreign wars, and the president told the assembled veterans that during Vietnam, just as in Iraq, people argued that the real problem was America's presence, and that if we would just withdraw, the killing would end. In fact, said the president, the problem in Vietnam was that American leaders lost confidence in their policy too soon and removed U.S. forces before they had accomplished their mission. Bush contended that giving up before the fight was won had damaged American credibility in the eyes of its Cold War adversaries, but the core of his argument had to do with the impact of bad American decisions on the peoples of Indochina. One unmistakable legacy of Vietnam is that the price of America's withdrawal was paid by millions of innocent citizens whose agonies would add to our vocabulary new terms like boat people, re-education camps, and killing fields. So here's something quite remarkable. Two leading voices in American politics were invoking totally contradictory lessons of America's lost war in Vietnam. For Kennedy, the Vietnam War taught the need to understand the limits of American power. For Bush, it taught the need to use that power more decisively, more boldly. The starkness of this debate, it seems to me, was nothing really new in the annals of American efforts to learn lessons from Vietnam. Even as the war was being fought, in fact, Americans grew increasingly divided between those who saw the U.S. commitment as a hopeless exercise to impose American preferences on a distant society that had little interest in bending to the U.S. will, and others who believed that U.S. frustrations flowed principally from poor choices about how to use America's vast power to good effect. That debate would ebb and flow across the decades following the fall of Saigon as policymakers and politicians, journalists and pundits and others used Vietnam repeatedly as a reference point for evaluating new dilemmas. Some Americans pointed to Vietnam to illustrate the need to reckon with the limits on American power. Others pointed to Vietnam to highlight the need for the United States to use its power to maximum effect. But I'd like to go one step further in exploring this debate, which I think on close inspection contains some really fascinating variety. I want to argue, in fact, that American efforts to learn lessons from Vietnam fall not into two, but into three basic schools of thought. And teasing apart these three intellectual traditions provides us, I hope, an orderly way of thinking about a debate that might otherwise seem somewhat formless. At the heart of these divergent schools lie divergent answers to the question of what precisely it was that went wrong for the United States. Broadly speaking, it seems to me, Americans cluster around three explanations. Some Americans, maybe a majority, hold that the U.S. defeat in Vietnam resulted from what I'm going to call a failure of understanding of the basic political realities in Vietnam. Other Americans contend that the war, like George W. Bush, failed due to failures of decision-making about how to wage it. And meanwhile, a smaller group, but still pretty important to my analysis here, believes that America's defeat stemmed from a failure of motives. It was the motives that were flawed. American leaders committed the United States to war on the basis of inappropriate or even dishonorable motives that doomed the United States to failure in Southeast Asia. So what I'd like to do for just a few minutes is to talk about each of these three schools of thought and a little bit about how they've been articulated over the last half century. So first, to the body of commentary that views America's defeat in Vietnam as the result of a failure to understand the basic challenges at play in that faraway country. People who've espoused this view essentially, it seems to me, take a tragic view of the war. This group generally views American intervention as a logical application of the broader American approach to resisting communist expansion, around the world during the Cold War. They acknowledged that given the mindset of the time, protecting an independent, non-communist South Vietnamese state from communist assault seemed to make good sense, consistent as it was with the general policy of containing communism through the application of America's enormous economic, political, and military power. But advocates of this school of thought contend that Americans made a huge mistake in viewing containment as the appropriate U.S. response to the turmoil occurring in Vietnam. Acting on mistaken assumption, the argument goes, Americans became ever more deeply ensnared in an unwinnable conflict from which they would extract themselves only after years of frustration and bloodshed. This is a view, by the way, that was given classic expression by the Harvard historian Arthur Schlesinger Jr. I've given you a little snippet here that really, I think, succinctly captures the essence of this tragic view of the war. Schlesinger, of course, was a historian, but also participated in U.S. decision-making during the time he served as an advisor to President Kennedy in the early 1960s. And I think you can see the core of this essentially tragic view. The famous line here is that the Vietnam story is a tragedy without villains, right? Everybody thought they were doing the right thing when it turned out that the policy was really a misapplication to a context in which American policy was ultimately inappropriate. Well, commentary of this sort varies in the answer it offers to the basic question of what precisely it was that American policymakers misunderstood. One variant emphasizes that Americans failed to appreciate the peculiar history of Vietnam, whether because of a general myopia about foreign societies or sometimes through a more specific lack of expertise that resulted from the purge of Asia experts in the State Department and other bureaucracies during the McCarthy period. In any case, this line of thinking emphasizes above all that Americans failed to appreciate Vietnam's long history of anti-colonial nationalism and the very intricate blend of nationalism and communism in that revolutionary movement led by Ho Chi Minh. And so blind to these complexities, U.S. policymakers incorrectly categorized the insurgency against the South Vietnamese regime as a simple case of communist aggression, when in fact it was quite a bit more complicated than that. A closely related point of view emphasizes that American leaders failed to understand that the principal challenge in Vietnam was fundamentally political rather than military in nature. And this line of reasoning suggests that U.S. officials believe that dramatic escalation could achieve U.S. objectives in Vietnam by inflicting unsustainable losses on communist forces and intimidating the Hanoi government. In fact, goes the argument, the central problem for the United States was really always political, particularly the failure of the Saigon government to win the support, the hearts and minds, if you like, of the population below the 17th parallel. A third variant suggests that Americans fell short in Vietnam due to an inability to grasp that U.S. material prowess was at the end of the day inappropriate to the basic challenges that confronted the United States in the war. This line of argument underscores that American leaders bristled with confidence in the 1960s about their ability to use American resources to bring development and security to countries like Vietnam. Yet American power, vast though it was, proved ineffective in satisfying the basic desires for national independence and economic modernity that motivated ordinary Vietnamese, in many cases, to take up arms against their own government in South Vietnam. Well, let me turn now to the second school of thought about why the United States failed in Vietnam, a view that Americans made bad decisions about how to use American power. Adherents to this viewpoint reject the idea fundamentally that the United States misunderstood the situation in Vietnam. Rather, this view maintains that American leaders got it pretty much right. South Vietnam was, in fact, a victim of communist aggression. Yes, perhaps there was some complexity in the motives of the revolutionary movement, but at the end of the day, what really mattered was that this was a cross-border act of aggression by North Vietnam against the South. The reason why the United States failed to achieve its objectives in Vietnam was a failure to wage an appropriate and necessary war in the right way. Indeed, the argument usually goes that Washington could have achieved its objectives if only it had made different decisions about how to pursue the war in military and political terms. I think the classic expression of this line of thinking came from Ronald Reagan in the 1980s. While campaigning for the presidency in 1980, Reagan famously declared that the American war in Vietnam, far from being a shameful act, was in fact, as he put it, a noble cause. But the real zinger in Reagan's speech, at least for the purposes of what I'm trying to get at tonight, was his contention that the United States must never again ask young men to fight and possibly die in a war our government is afraid to let them win. Here, Reagan is obviously claiming that American forces could have achieved victory in Vietnam if only their government had made different choices about how to use power. This point of view, by the way, was not confined to political discourse, hardly. In the realm of pop culture, Rambo, right, from the 1980s and other films, also doubled down on this theme that nefarious forces in American life had somehow stolen defeat from the jaws of victory. Well, what may seem like a relatively blunt contention about the reasons for America's defeat turns out, it seems to me, to be quite complicated if we take the time to dig into it. There was, in fact, a good deal of variation in how historians and other commentators have made the case over the years, with most of the variation driven by different responses to a pretty simple question: who exactly was to blame for preventing the United States from obtaining an achievable victory? And by far the most common position pins the blame, and I think this is the implication of Reagan's quotation, pins the blame on civilian leaders, especially, I think, Lyndon Johnson, although there's a pretty big cast of characters here who come in for criticism. Critics argue that LBJ and others escalated American forces too gradually, imposed excessive restrictions on the ability of the military to conduct the war as US commanders wanted, and did too little to mobilize the American people for what he, LBJ, understood 100% accurately was going to be a long and difficult war. So central to all this, I think, is this is often this image of necktie-wearing civilians gathered around, a breakfast table or a lunch table at the White House, thousands of miles from the battlefront, micromanaging the war, choosing bombing targets, for example, in order to avoid provoking the Chinese or alienating Congress or the American people by putting too much. By stirring too much alarm about what was happening thousands away in Vietnam at a time when the Johnson administration, of course, wanted to focus the attention of Congress and the American people on his very, very ambitious domestic agenda. A second variant of this failure of decision-making school usually has little positive to say about civilian leaders, so there's not like a sharp departure here. But others, it's important to point out, pin most of the blame for failure on segments of the American public. So this is a line of thinking that goes well beyond who was in the White House and who the cast of characters advising the president was. Among those who come in for criticism, of course, were the anti-war movement, whose activism is alleged to have constrained Washington's ability to wage the war more effectively. In this view, U.S. leaders made the right decision to commit combat forces in order to prevent the defeat of South Vietnam, and maybe even came close to achieving that goal after the Tet Offensive, only to have squandered those opportunities due to declining popular support for the war. Besides blaming anti-war activists themselves, adherents to this general school of thought sometimes single out particular institutions as responsible for sapping the U.S. will to see the commitment through to a successful end. Universities are often described as hotbeds of anti-war activism, whose prestige and influence in American life enabled them to exert disproportionate influence on American leaders. The media has often, of course, as we well know, been charged with spreading a falsely negative view about prospects for victory in Vietnam. And Congress is often blamed for impinging on the ability of the executive branch, especially in the Nixon period, to wage the war as it saw fit. The final two variants of the failure of decision-making school are really fascinating. They shift the focus from civilians and American society broadly to the US military. And these two variants make essentially the same basic point. It was military commanders who made the big mistakes by fundamentally misjudging the character of the war in Vietnam and making the wrong choices about how to prosecute the fighting. But the two variants make the case in starkly, indeed 180-degree opposite ways. One group of military analysts suggests that US commanders erred in viewing the Vietnam War essentially as a guerrilla conflict that didn't require an all-out commitment by American forces. In fact, this view holds that the core problem facing the United States was a cross-border invasion by a major conventional army supported from North Vietnam. US commanders, therefore, should have focused American power on the North by bombing it more intensively and using ground forces to block the infiltration of troops and supplies into the South, or even crossing at an earlier point into Laos, or even launching a limited invasion of North Vietnam. The other line of argument concerns with military decisions makes precisely the opposite point, contending that the United States made a grievous error by treating the war as a conventional struggle, when in fact it was in its essence a guerrilla conflict that required greater commitment to lower intensity methods of counterinsurgency, nation building, and pacification. So in sharp contrast to the champions of conventional warfare, this school contends that the most important military challenge in South Vietnam came from the indigenous guerrilla forces and the communist political apparatus under the control of the National Liberation Front. But US commanders steeped in an institutional culture that prioritized major conventional warfare against Warsaw Pact adversaries, downplayed pacification activities in favor of big operations involving enormous numbers of firepower and enormous concentrations of American troops. In this way, the argument goes the United States blew its best opportunities to really seize the hearts and minds, as the cliche goes, of the people and bringing them into alignment with the government in Saigon. Well, finally, I want to highlight a third broad school of interpretation about the reasons for American failure in Vietnam. This is what I'm calling the failure of motives school. This interpretive tradition suggests that American failure stems neither from misunderstanding nor from bad choices, but from improper basic motives for undertaking the intervention in the first place. For all their disagreements, after all, advocates of the failure of misunderstanding and failure of decision-making schools share one crucial thing in common. They do suggest that the American commitment to Vietnam stemmed from an understandable and even reasonable desire to block communist expansion. The difference between those two points of view lies mostly in their sense of whether the war was ultimately winnable or not. But advocates of this third line of interpretation reject this characterization as really far too generous to US leaders and propose instead that the United States went to war on the basis of highly questionable motives pursued by pretty narrow segments of the US population, or indeed elites, small categories of elites. Usually business interests, politicians pursuing narrow personal or partisan agendas, or in some cases, a kind of out-of-control national security apparatus. Think of Dwight Eisenhower's military-industrial complex. The argument focused on economics suggests that US leaders sought to defend South Vietnam mostly to protect a capitalist global order that was centered on the needs of the American economy. The argument focused on politics rests on the idea usually that leaders committed the country to war in order to protect the electoral prospects of for themselves or the political parties that they served, whose interests might well have been damaged by a defeat in Vietnam and the resulting "who lost Vietnam" debate that was bound to cripple them politically. The argument about the national security establishment suggests that the military, backed by powerful interests in industry and government, made decisions to protect and expand its prerogatives rather than on the basis of any sound understanding to actual threats to the United States. So the thread running through all these variants is, I think, the notion that Vietnam was simply an arena where the ambitions of powerful Americans played out. It's hardly surprising, therefore, that U.S. policy lacked the capacity to respond effectively to the realities of the political and social situation in faraway Vietnam. Failure of motives arguments are staples of a lot of academic writing about the Vietnam War, and I hasten to add that some of the most innovative studies to be published about the war in recent years develop these points with new precision and sophistication. But these themes are also common among dissent movements, right? First during the Vietnam War itself, and then among anti-war activists who have deployed the lessons of Vietnam in opposing U.S. intervention in other places and in other periods. I think we've all heard claims, right, about American policy toward Iraq and Afghanistan as having been driven by oil or larger economic interests or by the political interests of the sitting president or this or that political party. In political and policy circles, though, these themes get very little traction among individuals trying to make sense of the lessons of the Vietnam War. And the reason, I think, is pretty obvious. To impugn the motives of American leaders is to step outside the legitimate sphere of discourse and thereby to invite pretty quick rejection and thus to jeopardize one's future credibility in the worlds of journalism or certainly in politics and policymaking. Given the disincentives to this kind of analysis among prominent voices in American life, it's maybe no surprise that it's not very easy to come up with a single quotation like I've done with Reagan or Schlesinger that works nicely to encapsulate the failure of motives point of view. But here's one that I think works pretty well. Jimmy Carter's call in 1977 for a new era of principle and honesty in the making of U.S. foreign policy. I believe we can have a foreign policy that's democratic, that is based on fundamental values, that uses power and influence for humane purposes. We can also have a foreign policy, by the way, that the American people both support and, for a change, know about and understand, right? And on he goes to make a pretty stinging critique, and I think he uses the word Vietnam once or twice in this speech, but I think between the lines you can see that this is very much a bit of rhetoric that comes from that post-Vietnam moment, one of the rare moments when it was possible and even attractive for an American politician, in this case at the very highest levels, to engage in some pretty stinging critique of his own society. Well, let me bring all this to a close by asking simply what we might take away from what I've had to say over the last few minutes, in addition maybe to the hopelessness of ever resolving these controversies. I want to leave you with three thoughts. Most importantly, I hope that this framework, these broad schools of thought, provide a kind of typology that can help us understand the kinds of claims that we hear and are likely to continue to hear about the lessons of the Vietnam War. I flatter myself that this kind of analysis might be particularly useful over the next few days as our op-ed pages, our airwaves, and so forth are filled with more than the usual amount of discourse about the Vietnam War and its meaning. Understanding the intellectual traditions that have unfolded over the last half century is crucial, I think, in order to appreciate the widely divergent lessons that flow from them. If we buy the failure of understanding outlook, after all, the key lesson is probably that the United States must be far more cautious about using its power in faraway places. If we buy the failure of understanding outlook, the key lesson is probably that we need to make choices with greater precision, expertise, and maybe determination. If we buy the failure of motive schools, then the key lesson is probably that the United States must focus on the reform of its own political and decision-making institutions in order to use its power more effectively abroad. Second, I want to acknowledge the question that I've essentially left unanswered. Who's right? We can get into this in Q&A if you like. Which one of these schools makes the best sense? And like many academic historians of the war, I confess that I see validity in all three schools of thought, but would place the heaviest emphasis on the first and third. Still, I think we should recognize the important work that's been done by historians writing from the failure of decision-making perspective in recent years to show that U.S. policy made significant progress at different stages of the very long American embroilment in Vietnam, including by establishing an impressive degree of political stability in the 1950s, for example, or scoring notable battlefield progress in the period after the Tet Offensive. To acknowledge these complexities does not mean going so far as to suggest that that victory in Vietnam was somehow squandered. I don't personally come anywhere close to that. It does mean, though, that we're probably on a path toward a more sophisticated and nuanced understanding of the war that contained within it other possible paths besides the ones that we know from our history books. Mostly, though, my goal here is not to assert my point of view, but to leave you with a question of what you find most persuasive. And third and finally, it's worth thinking about how the debate will continue in the years to come. The passing of the Vietnam generation, though that's still many years off, will, I think, diminish some of the energy and passion with which Americans have debated the lessons of the lost war. But I also think that divisions over Vietnam are so thoroughly woven into the American social fabric that Vietnam is likely to remain a go-to analogy whenever the United States contemplates using its power abroad. The risk, of course, is that the debate will become increasingly detached from actual knowledge of the war, something that's no doubt already happening, even as the war retains a good deal of its power to move and to motivate people. So our challenge, I think, as people really deeply interested in the history of the war, is to assure that we continue to assess and reassess the war, and to assure as best we can that it is used in ways that bring enlightenment about the U.S. role in the world during the next half century. So I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
That is the challenge, and that's why we're putting it on digital saving form, so that we can make it available for years and years and years to come. All right, next we have Elizabeth Cobbs speaking about the ideas she had in her book, American Empire. Elizabeth. And if you have, those of you who are watching this as a live stream, if you have any questions, you can put them in the chat room, and there are cards going around here in the live audience if anybody wants to write questions. We'll go to that later.
Well, thank you very much. I really appreciate this opportunity to talk about the lessons unlearned. And I'm going to approach this rather differently, even though I think what Mark just did was wonderful, showing these kind of three schools of thought, which I think is really a great description of them. I actually think there's a kind of weird dishonesty in our conversations about Vietnam that's been there for a really long time. We have this idea that it was this kind of outlier, crazy loss. How can we explain it? And of course, there are all these debates about how to explain it. And so I think that there's this idea that it was somehow not a part of the mainstream of the United States policy. And so I think we're loath to face the most important lesson, which is that actually a Vietnam War was not some crazy, outlier, but it was actually the predictable outcome of the system we built that was producing great results elsewhere, but had poor results here. And so you don't want to lose the good results even though you've got to face the fact that you have poor results, so you explain them in some other way. And in a sense, the lie, if you will, although I don't think it's intentional, I don't think anybody's running around telling a lie, but the lie in ourselves, the cognitive dissonance that we don't really wrestle with, is the thought that we could have gotten all the great outcomes without suffering the really bad ones if certain people would have just handled this whole thing differently, in the various ways that Mark has described. That's not true, I don't think. The premises of the system, the security system, were both magnificent and deeply risky. Above all, it was a system that was based on the need, in fact, the demand for one nation to be its guarantor, to fight its battles. And as every student of war knows, you can't win them all. You just won't. The enemy will vary, the situation will vary. You can't win them all. If you tell yourself you can, you're setting yourself up for failure. So the problem is less about the individual decisions, I believe, of any president or general or ally or enemy than it is about the risks that were undertaken. And for the United States, the role of guarantor of a political system that has endured for basically 75 years or so, produced extraordinary benefits around the world and also for the United States, but it was also very costly. It could be very costly. It was very costly in Vietnam for the Vietnamese people, and it's been in the long term very costly for the United States in terms of blood and treasure, and also costly in terms of American identity and self-respect. That's the price we have paid. That's the price we are still paying for the system that was set up, that produced many, many wonderful things, that took bombed out cities and made them into paradises today. So what I look at, and one of the problems also of not understanding this larger perspective of the Vietnam War as a predictable outcome to some extent, is that not learning this lesson hampers our ability now to look at reasonable estimates of risks and rewards for various kinds of American policies, and to explore in a serious way the ways that we can responsibly reposition ourselves in the world going forward, which has got to be done on a path to a new world order. So how did the United States come to be in this role at all, the role that I call the American umpire? And the idea of somebody or an agency or a government above the fray is a very old idea. The idea that there could be some kind of world security system goes back to ancient Greece, to the Delphic League, and it reappeared in 1787 in the United States in the attempt to create a general government that would be above the 13 states that might otherwise come to blows, as in fact some of them nearly did, without going into the weeds there. And so in the Federalist Papers, one of the comments that was made by John Jay was, who shall command the Allied armies and who shall settle the terms of peace? And in cases of dispute, meaning between the states themselves, what umpire shall decide between them and compel acquiescence? Because you need somebody. You need somebody to backstop what is going to always be, a murky situation. And so the United States developed a kind of role of umpire. Well, the United States is probably the closest we come to tabula rasa in terms of a group of states coming into a new situation and working out rules amongst them. In World War I, the great devastation of the first industrialized war on the planet was so great that it prompted the effort to create, for the first time in Europe, this kind of umpire, if you will, this sort of organization above the fray of the states that would help to achieve certain goals. Now, by the way, they were building a new world order on top of an old world order. That wasn't true in the United States, where everybody's kind of coming in at the same time, more or less under the same rules. Here you have Ho Chi Minh in the middle, the industrialized war on the left, and Woodrow Wilson, Clemenceau, and Lloyd George on the right. So what were the goals of this? The old goal of this was to create a new world order, it pertained to the UN as well, to end wars of conquest and retaliation, to find a way to end what had been the story of humanity since humanity started writing things down. What would be the hurdles? Because they would be considerable. One of the great hurdles was decolonization. What are the nations? Who will be the nations? From Ireland to Indochina, Ireland was a big deal in 1920, 22. The other hurdle were the continuing territorial ambitions of some countries which were not really yet on board with this goal, including, of course, Hitler, Hirohito, and Stalin. Well, that was the idea, and it did not work. And you had a Second World War because of these obstacles that prevented the implementation of these goals. Not only in Britain and the Blitz of Britain, but the rape of Nanking, the Japanese invasion, of course, of China, brutal invasion, and ultimately culminating in atomic warfare by the United States. And this shadow of this bomb would condition all of the other decisions that came down the line. If you're not talking about that shadow, you're not really talking about what was on the ground that people had to think about when they made these choices. So this led to a second attempt after the second major industrialized war in human history to create a new system that would perhaps go back and try to create a system, at least on paper, that would resolve these issues. Well, now what this led to was, I'm leading up to two conferences that happened, yes, right here in San Francisco. San Francisco plays a big role in all this, I'm sure some of you know. And one of those was the founding conference of the United Nations here in 1945. And the idea there was to create a network, institutional framework to promote peace and promote territorial aggrandizement by one country against another. Well, that was a great idea in principle, and it established the principles. And that's not a small achievement, right? To establish the principle is actually a very important and preliminary achievement. But it also did not prove as sufficient because the security apparatus established to go with this on paper principle was rendered almost immediately defunct by Soviet expansion and by Western reactions to it. By Soviet expansion, this map just kind of gives you a little thumbnail sketch of what happens after the war when the Soviet Union dominates all of these countries of Eastern Europe to the point where the last one that had any popularly elected government, Czechoslovakia, fell to a communist coup in 1948. And what was at risk here was the concern about what was going to happen next in Greece and Turkey as this red wave, if you will, although it's kind of pink here, as that spreads out. And what happens is that Great Britain, which had troops in Greece and Turkey, told the United States in 1947, we are leaving. We are leaving, and you have a matter of weeks, and you will either bolster up this situation or it will become a part of this larger sphere. Now, by the way, Western Europeans were deeply reactive against the Soviet measures. We tend to me, it's also part of our, I think, kind of dishonesty. There's a lot of presumption that the United States was the country most concerned about Soviet movements. That is not true. And in fact, it was the Western Europeans, the Treaty of Dunkirk, followed by the Treaty of Brussels, to create defense unions. And they asked Truman, would you please join our Western Defense Union? And he said, no, thank you. We just got out of Europe. But things began to change with the British withdrawal from Greece, or at least the threatened British withdrawal. And this led to the Truman Doctrine, which is the first time that the United States said, okay, we'll put down money. And what the Truman Doctrine was essentially was money, but it articulated this other principle. And Truman said, I believe it must be the policy of the United States to support free peoples who are resisting subjugation. Free peoples who are resisting subjugation. And this is a mantra. You will hear it throughout the Vietnam War. You will hear it elsewhere. This is the idea that this is the guiding light of U.S. foreign policy. At this time, initially, it was just about money, not troops. But there was pressure. And in fact, what happens is that it begins to evolve towards a more active military participation because of the division of Germany. Germany, like Korea, like Vietnam later, there are many parts of the world which are sort of divided up because of the way territorial boundaries shift after World War II. And initially because of the occupation of Germany, there were a variety of occupying powers that eventually resolved into West Germany and East Germany. And East Germany, if you've got good eyesight, you'll see on the top right, Berlin was deep in the territory of East Europe, of Eastern Germany, East Germany. And it too was divided into sectors. And what began to happen was that the Soviet Union put pressure on Berlin and on the Western powers to evacuate Berlin because they wanted to have all of it for the communist-led Eastern European government, East German government, pardon me. This led to the Berlin airlift of 1948, 1949, when Berlin was cut off from sources of all basic kinds of support, food and coal and all the things that people needed to do just to survive and not freeze. And so what this led to was the decision by the United States. And by the way, I'm condensing a lot of stuff. Read the whole book if you want all the examples, okay? So I'm going for the main ones. The Berlin Airlift of 1948 helps to convince the United States that actually stating the principle is not going to be enough, giving money is not going to be enough. The United States is actually going to have to do what it really does not want to do, which is to return to Europe. And again, what was the Great Britain and France and the Benelux countries had asked the United States to join a defense union, and the United States had said no. A year later, the United States is involved in helping to form NATO. It wasn't our idea to have NATO. It was a continuation of this Western European effort to, as Lord Ismay, the first Secretary General NATO, later said when asked, what's the purpose of NATO? And he said, the purpose of the NATO alliance is to keep the Russians out, the Americans in, and the Germans down. Now, we tend to think, oh, Germans are so nice now. Who cares about Germans? That's not true. That's not how people felt then. Germany was so recently a totalitarian, aggressive, dangerous, vicious state under the Nazi government that they were really concerned about all of these dynamics, and they needed a force that would do that. Now, simultaneously, these things are all like a year apart. It's like a blink and the next thing happens. This also started to evolve in Asia, too. There was an Asian parallel. So first of all, we have the whole Western Europe, which is a big place, if you'll remember, right? Then simultaneously, things are evolving in this part of the world as well. Something to know about the UN conference is that China was not invited. So the basic world system that we are all a part of today is not something to which China was asked to give input. It was involved in the Civil War. There was a reason for it, but that was the fact. 1949, China consolidates under communist rule, and almost immediately, there's an invasion by North Korea of South Korea. Again, one of those divisions post-war, and it's the communist side, in all the cases we're going to talk about, that decides that we're going to reunify this territory under a communist government, under a communist leadership. So the impetus is coming from that direction. And this leads the United States to realize, it's not going to be enough to undertake these security measures just in Europe. But there's going to need to be more that happens. Because, as I said, part of what happens is that Korea, which had been divided at the end of World War II and had been a post-colonial nation, Japan had colonized Korea, so they hated the Japanese too, et cetera. And this leads to the need for another kind of security conference. Again, the United States is not the only one saying, oh gosh, we should be concerned about this. There are a lot of people concerned about it. And one of the basic things, and again, San Francisco in the news one more time in a very important way. And here you get a chance to see how it plays out. This idea that one country will be the guarantor, the umpire, the linchpin, the keystone in the arch, whatever metaphor you want to come for. The idea that there's one country that has to take that role. So what happens in San Francisco in 1951 is that there is a 3-part dance to respond to events in Asia. Because not only is the Korean War going on, but one of the other big dynamics is that nobody has signed a peace treaty with Japan. They hate Japan. By they, I mean Australia, New Zealand, Philippines. United States is the only country which almost doesn't hate Japan. We're the only country that has a peace treaty with Japan. So Japan, picture this. Communist China has now gone completely communist. There is a war in Korea. There is kind of nothing else out there other than Japan. Now Japan is right on the edge of those disasters. And Japan is a former enemy with which nobody wants to have any truck. So the United States gets involved in trying to organize a mutual agreement where everybody can sort of agree that they're going to cooperate. And so here in this city, in September of 1951, the first thing that happens on the first Saturday of this week-long conference is the signing of the ANZUS Pact, Australia, New Zealand, US. This is a military guarantee by the Australia and New Zealand are not going to agree to give peace with Japan. Let Japan rebuild? Let Japan become a big power again? Why would you do that? Well, I guess we could tolerate that if you promise that you will show up if things go, in a bad direction. So the ANZUS Pact, the rest of the week is taken up with organizing a pact between the U.S. and Japan, because Japan is also like, we don't know about dealing with any of these people. What are we going to do? We are bankrupted by this war. We are devastated. If we're going to participate in these kind of cooperative arrangements, then we need your guarantee. And who else is going to give it to us? Nobody else. At the last day of the conference, the other thing is that finally 49 nations agreed to peace with Japan. Why did they agree to peace with Japan? Because the United States has guaranteed everybody that you will be okay if that happens. So that's it, and I paraphrase Lord Ismay. This is my statement at the bottom. What was the purpose of ANZUS and all of that? To keep the Chinese out, the Americans in, and the Japanese down. Someone's got to promise to do all that. Otherwise, it's hell in a handbasket. So now we're coming into to Vietnam. So in Vietnam, you essentially have a very similar situation. Yes, there are many differences. There are different actors, there are different characters, of course, different history. All of these places have their unique histories. Some of them have great local leadership, some of them have terrible local leadership. Most of them are former totalitarians of one sort or another. West Germany was, awash in former Nazis, and Japan, former militarists, and Vietnam had its own series, and South Korea, Syngman Rhee. These are not great people, free peoples resisting subjugation. It's about which side are you on in this gigantic contest, where it seems that the world might, be in serious trouble. And so what happens is that this idea that the United States must at all times provide a blanket guarantee to the world. It's kind of a blanket reassurance that the promises we make, we will keep. And that statement, that willingness to back up that statement, becomes a very important part of world affairs. A kind of sacrosanct policy. And it's a setup, ultimately, for the tragic war in Vietnam. To give you a sense of this, Ike said, "We will not retreat 1 inch from our duty." JFK said, "We shall pay any price, bear any burden." I mean, these are blanket statements, right? We will not fall back. And by the way, sometimes they thought it was like a bit much. Robert Kennedy privately said at one point to his brother, he said, the Germans must wean themselves from the suspicion that the U.S. has written off its solemn obligations if a senior American official fails to visit Berlin once a month to affirm them. They were kind of like tired of reiterating it. We're here, we promise everybody we're here. And why does the U.S. get in this role? I mean, I think part of that goes back to that umpire role, that no other country had much experience with this. The United States is the last robust power, at least devastated by the war, and we can discuss that in question and answers. Anyway, so in Vietnam, the struggle was always the effort to retain a separate South Vietnamese country in the same way that they did in South Korea. That still exists today, the same way as in Berlin, although eventually, obviously, Germany reunified. The U.S. pledged its word. Now, by the way, it was under pressure to do this. I mean, it always kind of grinds my gears how much the French, and Mark Lawrence has done a fantastic job of showing how much the French and the British pressured the United States first to get into Vietnam, and then after the U.S. had pledged its word very publicly, tried to pressure them to get out. But there was always this sense of our credibility. We have to sustain our credibility. And I have to say, I've been around for a long time. I've studied this. Old enough that I marched against the Vietnam War. I mean, I've thought about this for a long time. One of the most horrifying things I ever read was this quote. This was 1965, and it was a low-level policy analyst, and he was trying to summarize for everybody. What are the U.S. war aims in Vietnam? 70% to avoid a humiliating U.S. defeat to our reputation as a guarantor. 20% to help keep South Vietnam and the adjacent territory from Chinese hands. 10% to permit the people of South Vietnam to enjoy a better, freer way of life. When I first read that, I thought, what vanity, what hubris, how terrible to take upon yourself. I don't want to look bad. And then when you actually see what that was all about, it wasn't like looking bad as a form of vanity or a form of hubris. It was about the sense that the whole world rode on this credibility of the United States, on its flat guarantee that even if it couldn't win, it would not give up. It would keep showing up. And it's sort of, in ways, this kind of, to me, kind of a terrible trap. At the same time, there was, not in Vietnam, not in Iraq, ultimately, there was peace for 70 years. Countries blossomed, the Asian tigers came about, all of these things that would not have happened without a secure and stable. You can hear Germans talk and French talk about how they were finally able to build a common economy because they didn't have to worry about one of them blowing the other's head off. Why? Because they all knew the United States would be there to keep the Russians out, the United States in, and the Germans down. That's what NATO was about. So what happened in Vietnam, of course, ultimately, is that, as I said, I just think you just can't win them all. And we spent all this time talking about, well, why didn't we win this one? If there was a formula for how to always win a war, somebody would have figured out, and that country would rule all across all time. But it's not the case. The problem is undertaking this kind of commitment. But at least we could be honest about it. At least we could say, yeah, it was awful and it was terrible. And that seemed the best thing to do at the time. So, of course, the problem is, I don't think it's about hubris. I don't think it's about bad motives. When Ronald Reagan said it was a noble cause, I actually wanted to, tear out my hair, but because I didn't think he was right. But in retrospect, he wasn't wrong. It was a noble cause. It was a lost cause. It was as noble a cause as helping out South Korea or helping out the Berlin or helping out the Japanese or any of these commitments that we made. We said, we will show up if you are threatened. Certainly at least as noble as that. So then it's really a problem of, how do you let go of the tiger that you've got by the tail? And what do you say to the people who you turn your back on and who you let the tiger eat? Out of necessity. So under the result of the premises of this policy, 5 American presidents who were as different from one another as men can be practically and still be from the same country and same, not even same socioeconomic class, really different people, they all follow the same policy. And sometimes you read the Vietnam War and you're like, well, that guy was stupid. And then the next guy was stupid. Oh, and can you believe it? The next guy did the same stupid thing. It's not because they were stupid, because they were following this policy that was producing great results many places and it resulted in terrible tragedy here. So the problem was not that Vietnam was different from South Korea or West Berlin. We just lost. Ultimately, that was the big difference. We lost. The war was unsustainable. Now, unfortunately, of course, it resulted in the exodus of 1 million people, more than 1 million people, because a lot of them, the boats capsized and they were never counted. Boat people, and I have this feeling sometimes that we've gone down kind of a rat hole of blaming rather than trying to look at what the larger lesson is. We blame the presidents or the generals, or we blame the North Vietnamese, or we blame the anti-war movement, or we blame the media. Sometimes we also blame the victim. Maybe these people didn't deserve for us to help them. What would make them potentially any less deserving than any of the other people that the United States was setting out to try to save? And I think that was one of them. That would be, to me, as a kind of a shameful outcome, and we're doing better with that now, and I'm glad to say that we are. Anyway, there were times for repositioning, and one of the reasons why the Vietnam War did not produce we were more risk averse, but we're still continuing the basic security system that we still more or less have up to the present. I think there wasn't a great repositioning, partly because the Cold War continued, right? The reasons for these policies remained. Now, when the Berlin Wall came down in 1989 and the Soviet Union, was reinvented as Russia in 1991, there was a decade there not long, because 9/11 happens only 10 years later, a decade in which not only the United States, but the world itself could have really entertained the idea of how do we reposition now that that's over. And it was just kind of nice not to, like, just to forget about all that stuff. And so instead, the United States continued on its basic path. Madeleine Albright, Clinton's Secretary of State, saying we are the indispensable nation. She was true, I mean, she was correct, but it was also like nobody should be indispensable. World security is only as strong as the world security apparatus is. You can't hang it all on one country, which will, by the way, make mistakes and lose wars, because it just does. So instead what happened is we got, not using that opportunity, the United States, 9/11 happens, and we get into war in Iraq. Why? To defend our credibility one more time, and that was part of the argument for the war in Iraq. So again, that sounds so vain, but I don't think ultimately that, yeah, vanity I'm sure does play some role, but I don't generally think that's the major reason. I really don't. I think a lot of these presidents really did not want to be in the position they were, but felt it was necessary. So where do we stand today? I mean, I think that we need to learn this lesson, that don't go down the blame game or Monday morning football or whatever. It's really about, we got there because there was a path that had to do with the security apparatus, and it made sense, and it produced great results, but it led to unacceptable risks in the long term that had to be accepted for a while, but don't have to be accepted now. So what this means is that what the world needs the United States less today than it did before. That's really good. It doesn't mean the United States is not needed at all. It's one of the largest, most prosperous countries in the world. But, and in fact, I think one of the problems is because right now our security apparatus is under attack from within by the United States. A lot of critics in the United States, they just blow it all apart. Let's get out of NATO. What are we doing there? And that's actually not a bad question to ask. But the more important thing is, how do we do these things responsibly? Because this system has built a much better world than the one we saw in 1919 and the one we saw when we left in 1945. And I think one of the reasons why we have this persistent criticisms today is because the liberal policy establishment, by which I mean Republican and Democratic, absolutely, has not been really honest with the American people about the costs, inevitable, predictable costs of this security system, which were important to bear for a while, even as we know that resulted in great tragedies as well, but that now can be rethought. And in fact, if any nation is indispensable today, China is an indispensable nation. The security apparatuses that were designed out of necessity, as people thought then, and it seems in retrospect they were largely right, a number of them were designed to keep China out. You can't keep China out of the world. That's hubristic. That is a fool's errand. But devising a world economy that embraces China, that reckons with it. I mean, we are still in South Korea. That is not a good thing. Some system has to come forward that will move forward in a new way without the United States being the linchpin in Japan and in Korea and here and there and all around, because it's provocative at this point, I think. So we're overdue for a rehaul. We need substantial conversations about where we go from here. I like, nobody likes the umpire. In fact, it's guaranteed that half the people hate the umpire, right? They just, somebody's going to dislike you because you are not going to make all the right calls. Even if you make a right call, they'll still hate you. And if you make a wrong call, well, then you're hated for a good reason, at least. Umpiring should be rotated. When it comes to, I like to conclude with this cartoon only because if you are amenable to that offer, I'm prepared to respond with this facial expression. We have these kind of moving the deck chairs around conversations about foreign policy. What we need today is not another San Francisco conference, maybe a Singapore conference. The United States does not have to host any longer. It has to be an important, active participant in these things. But if you hold the tiger by the tail too long, ultimately the tiger will eat you too. Thank you.
Just a reminder to our online audiences and also here, if you have any questions, we'll be having a Q&A in a half an hour. Yale Ferguson.
Good evening or late afternoon. Well, it's getting to even now. So thank you, George, and everyone at the Commonwealth Club, World Affairs, and Humanities West for making this program possible. It's a pleasure to be here, not least in this really distinguished speaker company. But I'm also keenly aware of the gravitas of this evening, looking back on the 50th anniversary of the very day the Vietnam War ended. It's a sort of spooky feeling. So many soldiers and civilians on both sides dead, gravely injured, or whose lives were otherwise changed forever. Perhaps some of you here tonight are listening in. If you're a veteran, well, we can only honor your service, not enough of which honoring happened to some of you when you returned from Vietnam because things had gone so sour. There it is. Well, Vietnam was a marker in eroding the American public's trust in their government, and a trend that, unfortunately, has only worsened, I think, over the years. On another side here, the war also supported the United States decision to end conscription and rely on an all-volunteer professional army. So here in advance are two examples of a Vietnam legacy. So the subject of my talk, if you saw the little brochure, is the Vietnam War fog extends to its lessons and legacy. That business about the fog, most of you probably picked up, refers to McNamara's book on the fog of war and the documentary that followed with that. Highly recommended to you if you've never seen it. It's a moving document, I think. And what McNamara did was to give some of his lessons that he had learned in his long experience, but many of them from his experience in the Vietnam War. And so I just want to read this from him. What the fog of war means is war is so complex, it's beyond the ability of the human mind to comprehend all of the variables. Our judgment, our understanding are not adequate, and we kill people unnecessarily. And he went on to quote Wilson after World War I. We've just met Wilson tonight again. "We won the war to end all wars," said Wilson. "I'm not so naive or simplistic to believe we can eliminate war. We're not going to change human nature anytime soon. It isn't that we're not rational. We are rational, but reason has its limits." And then we have George Hammond giving us Donald Rumsfeld as a little thing to reflect on, and I've got to put him in here too. He told us about the Iraq War. They're known knowns. They're things we know. We also know that they're known unknowns. That is to say, we know there are some things we do not know, but they're also unknown unknowns. The ones we don't know, we don't know. And then he added, stuff happens. Well, comedians of that day really had fun, with Rumsfeld's comments. But he wasn't stupid. There's a lot of wisdom in there in an interesting way. In fact, there are just not all that many lessons that are for sure no knowns. It's hard to read any complex experience accurately when you're in the middle of it or still too close to it in time to the experience. There's perhaps even more subjectivity when you're involved in reading the past. Of course, there are those readers who deliberately twist the past for their own purposes. Holocaust deniers are a perfect example of that. And Mr. Putin does a bang-up job in using his own history when he wants it. Well, ever since George invited me to speak on this program, I've been thinking about the possible lessons of Vietnam War and why it is so hard to establish them. So just so you know, my personal definition of a proper lesson is something learned from experience that may be helpful to future decision makers who act in relatively comparable situations. Now that's the problem, those last three words, relatively comparable situations. I believe the fundamental reason the lessons of Vietnam are so difficult to tease out is because Vietnam, at least in one sense, is really sui generis. It's a one-of-a-kind case. It's unique. Now, I don't want to overdo this. We've heard a different perspective, which is entirely correct, in my opinion. It is many things, but it is also something special. I can't tell the whole Vietnam story tonight, no way, but I'd like to highlight a few features of it so you can appreciate something of its extreme complexity. And I apologize to you if you already know the whole history in depth. But these, to me, are the broad things that made this particular case so special. To begin with, foreign policies, foreign power influences, and outright interventions have been a regular feature from Vietnam's history from the very start. For instance, Han China dominated most of Vietnam from 111 BC for 1,000 years. And after China's influence failed for another 1,000 years or so, the pattern was a succession of local dynasties and civil wars and still more foreign interventions from Han Chinese dynasties, also the Mongol Yuan dynasty and the Cham and the Siamese. And then from the 15th to the 18th centuries, Vietnamese themselves conquered the Mekong Delta and what is today Cambodia. Then at last came European imperialism in the form of a series of French military expeditions from 1858 to 1885. French Indochina by 1893 included, as many of you know, Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos. Later, Japan occupied the entire area for 5 very important years during the Second World War. Now, I'm going to add a little here, going to pause here in this chronological thing and talk just a minute about Vietnam's domestic situation. Vietnam has a coastline, rugged mountains in the center of it, and 2 big deltas and plenty of jungle. This is not a place conducive to modern mechanized warfare, but very conducive to guerrilla warfare. Mark Lawrence has written in his concise international history of the Vietnam War, which I highly recommend, that Vietnamese society under the French evolved into an increasingly westernized, entrepreneurial, capitalist group of educated elites in the cities, roughly 10% of the total population, and the other 90% of the population who were peasant farmers in the countryside. And then by the early 20th century, 5% of the population owned more than half of the arable land. Cities are mostly in the south, Saigon by far the largest and a real center, and but there was plenty of agriculture, many peasants in the southern countryside. And the southern countryside was later the focus of much of the back and forth. They were continually, those peasants, continually being pacified, subverted, or recruited by all contending parties during the Vietnam War. Forming strategic hamlets was one of several eventually unsuccessful strategies attempted by the U.S. and anti-communist government forces. So, after the Japanese defeat in World War II, a three-way conflict erupted among France, communists, and anti-communists. Some of this was communism, and some of it, as we heard this evening so correctly, was nationalist. And it was an explosive combination. Officially, by 1949, Vietnam was a unified, autonomous republic member of the French Union. In fact, the communists under Ho Chi Minh were in actual control of most of Vietnam from their primary strength in the north. In May 1954, the French were defeated at the Battle of Dien Bien Phu, and the situation quickly evolved. Vietnam was independent a month, and then a month later was divided into two states, North and South Vietnam, which almost then immediately declared war against the other. Pushing back, in a sense, all those civil wars, touching all the memories of all those civil wars, going back to the beginning of this is a place where civil wars have happened for almost always, as well as this foreign intervention. Where was I? The wars divided in two states. North Vietnam found support from China and the Soviet Union, and South Vietnam from the United States. As you know, the Vietnam contest thus became increasingly international, global in scope. Now, you have to understand that international global context in a broader sense. The Vietnam War played out against an already Cold War context and was preceded by the Korean so-called conflict in 1950-54. This is in many ways a very different case. Yes, there were some resemblances to one another, but in this case, the United States had a United Nations Security Council mandate to go into Korea and sort this situation out. It's a very special moment because the Soviet Union, who was not happy about this, chose that moment to be absent from the UN. They were protesting this and that. And this is a time when China was still Taiwan. So a broad UN force was fielded under General MacArthur with no direction at all from the UN Security Council when the Russians scurried back and exercised their veto. The General Assembly passed a resolution taking responsibility for all this, but they had very little real authority. And in fact, the United States ran most of the show. And of course, General MacArthur at the head of that command until he was finally relieved of his command by Truman, if you remember, because he insisted on carrying the war to the Chinese in the north. The final result of that war was at best a stalemate with a divided North-South Korea along a 54th parallel line that still exists today. And you note that the Korean War was fought without fear of a nuclear war because the Soviets, although they had the bomb, did not yet have a deliverable, projectable nuclear capacity. Well, the U.S. could not claim a UN mandate in Vietnam, but it did have allies who provided some support and some troops. And over this war, there hung at least a remote nuclear war cloud. But the war occurred at a time when the United States was transitioning from a preoccupation with superpower nuclear standoffs to a new conviction that Cold War contests would play out mainly in other places in the world, in proxy wars in many less developed countries. So that was behind the development of the prevailing U.S. strategy of flexible response, inspired by General Maxwell Taylor and faced with guerrilla jungle warriors in Japan, in Vietnam, the resort to air power, search and destroy helicopter missions, rolling thunder, large-scale bombing, napalm, the toxic defoliant, Agent Orange. And in the end, the whole strategic bundle failed with great embarrassment and terrible loss of life. A guiding assumption by the U.S. Over all of this was the domino principle, the domino effect, the belief that communism's appeal was so great that if one country went communist, like dominoes, they'd all go the other way. Well, something had to be done to stop this from happening. That theory seemed to be loosely related to the appeasement theory, I think, that came from the Hitler pre-World War II experience. That if you let one domino fail, more would follow. More would follow. So concern about and involved in Vietnam stretched over 4 U.S. presidencies. We heard about this earlier this evening. Eisenhower, JFK, Johnson, and Nixon. And U.S. decision-making during the various stages of the Vietnam War has been very widely studied. And I think there's almost, but not quite, a consensus, as we heard really clearly this evening, that the war was largely well-intentioned, but gravely flawed. To be blunt, successive U.S. decision-makers, including some advisors who were indeed the best and the brightest America had to offer at that time, and big hitter Henry Kissinger during the Nixon administration, nearly all of these who waded ever deeper into Vietnam's jungle quagmire and historically turbulent politics did not themselves fully understand what they were getting into, what, if any, political and military strategies might work in the tangled Vietnamese context, or how to get out with dignity when the time came. Magical thinkings that things might somehow get better sprang eternal. And all too often, the supposed solution to setbacks, and there were plenty along the line, very discouraging moments, the answer too often was, I think, military escalation, more bombing, more troops. Well, each president couldn't focus just completely on Vietnam, of course. He had to worry about U.S. domestic politics, getting his own policies into law, the next election for himself or for his party, and not least, and we heard about this evening, quite rightly, America's reputation and credibility in a dangerous world. It's a fact, though, on the other hand, that each president, each of those 4, harbored grave personal doubts about the war. Johnson had a free hand to do whatever he wanted with regard to the war after Congress passed the 1964 Gulf of Tonkin Act, which gave him carte blanche. But Johnson privately called the Vietnam War, I wish I could do this in his accent, just the biggest damn mess I ever saw. But there was no more enthusiastic hawk when his closest early advisors like McNamara, Dean Rusk, General Westmoreland, and the General Staff convinced him to engage the North Vietnamese directly and militarily, and later to escalate mightily. He had another council, that wise men, people like Dean Acheson and George Kennan and Averell Harriman, Omar Bradley. I mean, there were a bunch of terrific people, but in due course, they supported Westmoreland's escalation strategy. Probably, I think, because his strategy appeared to be the only possible winning strategy that was still left standing by that time. I believe most of the advice along the way was sincere, however misguided or wrong. But close advisors did oversell their proposals, and they were careful to put the most optimistic spin on the frequent bad news that kept coming night after night. It must also be said that Johnson and Nixon, as well as some of their civilian and military spokespersons, did not hesitate to lie regularly to the general public about the situation on the ground in Vietnam. And as that situation deteriorated to hopelessness, Nixon and Kissinger committed to getting out of Vietnam, but then kept waiting for the right moment when there might just be a chance for peace with honor. That moment never arrived. And in the end, the outcome was an ignominious defeat. So where does that leave me with regard to the three schools that Mark sketched? I really fit best in that first school that viewed the war as essentially a tragedy. Washington committed the nation to war on not irrational motives. I mean, I can see I might have done exactly the same thing at that point. I don't think I would have been nuts to do it. But they got wound up stuck in a quagmire that no one had foreseen and that they just didn't know what to do about. Well, China and Soviet decision makers were also confused, and they waxed and they waned in their political support for North Vietnam because Mao and some Russian leaders were gradually becoming more receptive to better relations with the West. Khrushchev proclaimed his desire for peaceful coexistence in 1956, although, of course, the Cuban Missile Crisis followed in 1972, only 6 years later. So détente and arms control progress with the Soviets much more associated with the 1969 to 79 decade. U.S.-China relations became much warmer with ping-pong diplomacy in 71, 72, Nixon-Kissinger's Beijing state visit, and the recognition displacement of Taiwan for the PRC as the UN permanent member, rather than Taiwan, the PRC, and China member seat in the UN General Assembly. And meanwhile, while they were waxing and waning and not knowing what to do, the bitter differences with regard to the best ideological stance or stances, political tactics, military strategy, also persistently challenged Vietnamese leadership, both in North and South Vietnam. They were mixed up too. So now I have to try to sketch out the Vietnam. I've tried to do that. What are we going to do? Okay, the big moment. What are the lessons? Trumpet kind of sounds here. What are those lessons, okay? An anticlimax answer. Few at best. Unfortunately, most lessons that have been suggested are not really Vietnam specific. They might have been learned from almost any war, and they're blandly generic, and they're difficult and perhaps even dangerous to try to operationalize. Again, given the unique dimensions of the Vietnam War, it's going to be a very hard thing to do, to find a future really, truly comparable case to apply any of those presumed lessons to. Now, just consider a couple of lessons of 11 that McNamara offers from his own experience. Actually, the first one's from the Cuban Missile Crisis. He empathized with the enemy. I think he really means know the enemy, try to understand the enemy. Alas, for that lesson, emphasizing, or better yet, knowing the enemy sounds terrific, but it's awfully hard to do. We don't even, I think, understand ourselves, do we? When you look in the mirror and ask, oh boy, who am I? Well, to the contrary, it's I think it's probably better to respond to what the enemy does rather than what we think might be the motivations behind those actions. But that said, I do remember, and I love General George Patton's wonderful line in the 1970 Patton movie. Remember when the German Rommel's tanks were proceeding in dust, in defeat, and he called out, at least in the movie, right? Rommel, you bastard! I read your book. He was trying to empathize. So another McNamara lesson. Proportionality should be a guideline in war. Well, it's nice to keep things tit for tat, but sometimes the only way you win a war is to put it all in there and go for a blow, a big blow. If it fails, of course, you're back there. It's kind of holding a very bad position, but sometimes you have to do it. Here's another lesson. Some have said, avoid making war in an alien terrain and culture. Prudent, yes. But of course, sometimes there may be only, no alternative to doing it. And here's another. If you're a decision maker or a group of decision makers, make sure you have the best advisors. Genuinely welcome internal dissent. And do not lie either to one another or the general public. They will eventually find you out anyway, and there will be even more hell to pay. Actually, that lesson works pretty well for Vietnam, and I like that one. Kind of hard to do, though. Good advisors are few and far between. Yet another might have been a lesson from Vietnam. State building and nation building are related, but they're distinct. And they're direct possible goals of military intervention. But they're hard things to do, and a lot harder than you might think, and they ought to be avoided at all costs. I want to give you Colin Powell's doctrine now, which this one I really do like. Colin Powell, back when he was Joint Chief of Staff Chairman in the run-up to the 1990-91 Gulf War. His is actually an expanded version of General Caspar Weinberger's doctrine in 1984, which was based mainly on Vietnam. Of course, he was Reagan's Secretary of Defense. Okay, here's Colin Powell. When you're going to go to war, is a vital national security interest threatened? Do we have a clear, attainable objective? Have the risks and costs been fully and frankly analyzed? Have all other nonviolent policy means been fully examined and exhausted? Is there a plausible exit strategy to avoid endless entanglements? I think sometimes you might need several exit strategies depending upon how things go. Have the consequences of our action been fully considered? Is the action supported by the American people? And he might have added Congress there. They're not people, they're congressmen. Do we have genuine, broad international support? And he might have added, I think, that sometimes the most insightful and constructive critique of war plans may very well come from your allies. Friend, this isn't work. Well, I just have to say that one lesson I think really was truly learned, and it was widely proclaimed, and it does still resonate to us today. Never again. No more Vietnam. Now, I wonder how clearly it resonates and so on. The oldest of the Vietnam generation is, I don't know how old, but the median age is 71. And in a sense, as we said, the high school students kind of look at that ancient history. Lastly, and I'm going to stop after this. In closing, we might question how much political and military leaders really care about and seek lessons from the past. As I said, Putin is an exception, but his past is la-la land historical fantasy. Military strategists are not always fighting the last war because they're rightly aware that geopolitical contexts and alliances and weapons technology and all other factors, they change. So they're aware of that. But I do wonder how well the strategists have succeeded over the years in reading the changed situation. How well have they done with that? Now, we've had a very good record in many respects. This is the other side of the coin. But for perspective, the United States arguably has either lost or failed and/or to achieve key objectives in every one of its wars since World War II, except the Cold War, which was a larger thing, and the Gulf War, 1990-91. Afghanistan has always been a particularly difficult case. I mean, a real sinkhole, as every intervenor from at least Alexander the Great and the recent Russians would tell you. The U.S. exit from Afghanistan in 1971, which we probably all remember, was a very messy thing and had sort of images of Vietnam, at least going through my mind at the time. Not really all that comparable. And then there was the debacle of the Iraq War, the weapons of mass destruction that never were, the painful lesson we hope somebody learned that if you break it, you've got to put it together again. Not only Iraq, but the entire sort of delicate balance in the wider Middle East. There's always a delicate balance there. It's always going on. It's a mess. And there's been nothing but chaos and violence ever since that war, the Islamic State, the Hamas attack on Israel, Gaza, Hezbollah, and horrible everything else. Nor, frankly, if we could return to more halcyon times and not talk about things like that, and I wish we could, has multilateral military action in support of peacekeeping and humanitarian goals, the right to protect, and nation building been all that successful. I mean, that was a beautiful time to me when we were really trying to make things better. And it was a beautiful time. Well, unfortunately, not so successful overall. So finally, how relevant does Vietnam remain in the current context of nuclear deterrence and conflicts in Ukraine and the Middle East and South China Sea? Now, maybe we can talk about this in some of the questions and answers. The elephant in the room, I think, is that the political and military world today is almost, I mean now, is almost unrecognizable from the liberal world order and United States superpower, that guarantor that existed only a few months ago. That was when I first wrote that little bit about how relevant all this is to the war, those wars. I wrote that just a short time ago. It's a different world, completely different world. We are in uncharted waters, and we are going to have to rethink a lot of everything we think we might have learned from Vietnam and anywhere else, because it's a whole new ballgame. And frankly, I'm not looking forward to it. Thank you.
Fortunately, we have a little bit of time for Q&A, and by the end of the Q&A, we will have that critical perspective for the New World Order that you're talking about, because you're going to supply the three of you.
I'm looking forward to it.
That's part of the goal of the whole program. Anyway, thank you all very much for coming. This was fantastic. All right, so let's start talking about the application to current times. So we have a situation where we say, as somebody said, you can't go to an alien culture, an alien civilization. So, first of all, the use of the word alien is kind of alienating, and I think if we just say, we have all these human cultures, and as you discussed about how much history they have, there's thousands of years of history in each of them. We might think our culture is a little bit more flexible because it's new, but it's not that flexible either. So if you've got all these different cultures throughout the world, let's use an example, Cuba. How many of you think we would be in better shape right now with Cuba if we had just said in 1958, 59, okay, Castro, you took over. You can do what you want to, what the people want you to there. And the United States isn't going to interfere. And just let it go. What do you think would have happened if we had not made an enemy out of Cuba and said, it's all right if there's a semi-communist totalitarian state on Cuba instead of what was there before, which was a dictatorship by the casino interests or something like that. So what do you think would have been different about the last 50-some years? Go ahead, Elizabeth, you can start. You're talking about umpiring. So if we didn't umpire, if we stood back and said, okay, we're not going to interfere.
Yeah, I think that the interventions in Cuba were a big mistake. I think that those were unnecessary. I think if we hadn't done that, again, you have to sort of say, what would have been the effect of that? And of course, the interpretation at the time was, we can't possibly, allow communism over here, but we have communism over here. So it wasn't effective, and the sky didn't fall, and they're still there. So I think that part of the problem is, I would mention North Korea. I think to some extent, when you make these unalterable, we will always oppose you things, that actually bolsters up and prevents more peaceful kinds of change from unfolding. And there again, people were sort of aware of that at the time. Robert Kennedy thought, I learned this at the LBJ library. Never got a chance to use this fact, but it was interesting. At one point I was reading about some stuff from Robert Kennedy, and he was saying, why are we telling Americans they can't travel to Cuba or North Vietnam? Isn't it the Soviets who limit travel? And now we're telling our people you can't go places? So, this is the problem. You start to, the national security apparatus we developed has undermined, from the CIA to the National Security Agency to the, standing armies. These have been big costs of the policies. It's not to say the policies were worthless. That's part of what I'm trying to say here, is that these were big costs that were paid, and it would be great if we could start to unravel those costs to some extent. I think we have to.
Yeah. If we focus on the outcome, you say there's the means, and if you have to be patient and say, well, I can accept an alternative government to exactly what I want for a short period of time, because it'll actually be maybe a shorter period of time than if I oppose them and reinforces their situation. How about you, Mark? What do you think about the Cuba situation?
I would certainly agree that things would have gone down a much more peaceful, happier path if it were not for many of those decisions that were made quite early after the Cuban Revolution. It seems to me, though, hard to imagine that path having played out because of the almost automatic skepticism, I think, that came quickly to American minds about people who looked and acted and spoke like Fidel Castro. Even if he wasn't a close ally of the Soviet Union, there was still, I think, an aversion to revolutionary movements and a suspicion that over time they would in fact wind up in the communist camp. And here's another place where I would acknowledge the great importance of domestic politics. I think any president or prominent member of Congress and so forth, when confronted with even a non-communist but still revolutionary Cuba, would fear the political attacks that would come from showing too much acquiescence in something that directly challenged the long-term American domination in Cuba.
Politically unpalatable, but maybe wise.
But let me just add one last thing. The Cuban Missile Crisis did show, however, that the extremely ideological bent of Fidel Castro which was evident, was such that he did really welcome and encourage Soviet placement of Soviet missiles on the island. So, I mean, willing to actually use his own island as kind of target practice, if necessary, in some gigantic, nuclear conflict. So I think that some of those, that was challenging. There were real threats, real threats.
Totally agree with that. But it's an interesting thing because in the very beginning, if you remember the history, no one was quite sure where Castro was going to end up. He had several, he knew the U.S. very well. There was some thought he was going to be a reforming Democrat and so on. He made the decision. I mean, he really did. And at that point, all the forces that we've been discussing here came to bear. And in 1962, I mean, the world practically came to an end over this. But what I think is so sad is that there have been these long years. Castro's dead now. We've had all of these opportunities to find a moment to really embrace the Cubans, and we haven't done it. I mean, how foolish is that? And again, it's domestic politics.
Cowardice.
All right, so you said something that reminded me of something else. So let's go right to the current time. In Syria, we have this new leader who used to be in ISIS, okay? So it's a little bit like Castro. He's saying he wants to make peace with Israel. He's saying, so I think we're in the same sort of situation. Everybody kind of doesn't know if they can trust him and what he's planning on doing because of his past and what he said before, and now he's saying something else. Can we trust him? So you think that we can learn something from how we dealt with Cuba and Syria? Anybody want to tackle that one? I know that's not the topic, but that's similar.
I'll jump in.
Okay.
He's somebody enigmatic figure himself now. And it's certainly not a time to go in there and just embrace him, fully, both because you don't know quite what you're getting into, but also because you don't want to spoil him. I mean, you don't want to taint him with, pro-Yankee, all this stuff. It's a big, big mistake to do that. But I would say, for heaven's sake, give him every possible benefit of the doubt. Do everything you can to encourage. This is one slightly glimmer of hope in a place we haven't seen a little hope in a long, long time.
Trust but verify.
And don't assume that it's up to us to decide, us meaning U.S., United States. And this is where that process of pulling back and saying other people need to figure these things out. That's how people figure things out. Being told, you need to figure it out. And that is a really important exercise, I think.
I mean, I think one of the silver linings on Iraq and Afghanistan may be a greater willingness to try, right, with leaders who 20 or 30 years ago would have seemed sort of outside the realm of the possible when it came to forging a reasonable relationship. But I think, Afghanistan and Iraq both showed the endless challenge of trying to find local leaders who had credibility in their own societies and who would also, work cooperatively with the United States or with the West more generally. And this may be one area where a Donald Trump actually has something really going for him. Right? I think that more transactional kind of mentality that he brings to foreign policy may actually bring some benefits in some instances, and perhaps something like this could be one of them.
Right. So that's one of these questions. Will contemporary trends to make America irrelevant eliminate efforts of warmongering sorts to influence international outcomes? Okay, so I think that's one focus on the question. My twist on that is, okay, especially being San Francisco, there's not too many people who admire what Donald Trump is up to. But I think it's important to see it in the context of reaction to, as you said, your whole history of we've been playing this role for a really long time. We're not in the situation we were after World War II when we had 50% of the economy of the whole world. We're now down under 10%. So we're in a totally different situation, and we have to adjust, or we don't have to, but we should adjust. So the question is, it's adjusting is happening. The adjustment is happening this way, and he's making this one suggestion. And I think if we just say that's at least not totally irrational to try to think about this and to think about the new thing. But if you were his advisor, and assuming that he would be listening to you as an advisor, what would you say? Okay, I can understand why you want to change the direction of our foreign policy, but let me tell you about process, or let me tell you about tell you about how to get from where we are to where you want to go. So, talk about anybody want to take that on? That'd be great.
We.
Go ahead, yeah. I can tell you're going to jump in there.
Oh boy, yeah, you really set them up there.
We don't ask.
Yep.
We don't ask easy questions.
No, I would say yes. Rethink the U.S. role in the world. It's a high time to do this. We're moving out of this, regardless of what's happening. The world is changing, and we've got to adapt. You can't go on doing the same old thing and same old. And if you should be telling the Europeans a long time ago, a lot harder. Listen, time's going to be coming when you're going to have to do this. Mm-hmm. It's a little late now, to suddenly, but all right, you make these big changes. You don't make them in the first 10 days of your administration, and simply wreck hundreds of years of history in 10 days with, frankly, I think, not a clue how to put it back together again. Mm-hmm. I mean, if he had some great vision, I don't believe it. I mean, I will be amazed to see if one somehow emerges, because it is all transactional, and it is, and that's the other thing, it's all so meanly executed. So, in your face, there's certain psycho here going on. This makes no sense to me. If you're trying to actually succeed in the world in the end, even if people don't want to push back, they're going to push back when you're in their face in that way. So you see, I have a few concerns.
Yeah. Elizabeth?
Yeah, and I certainly agree with, you don't go out and wreck it. You built a system, it had some problems, it had some liabilities, but it produced tremendous prosperity and peace. Human life expectancy doubled, just kind of basic stuff. So you don't want to get rid of that and undermine it. I think, to me, part of what's happened is that I don't think that there is a coherent vision. And in fact, speaking of transactional, one of the things that most disturbed me is that there now seems to be a kind of going back to pre-1919 morality. What happened with the First World War was, as I said, the establishment of a principle. The principle being we need to take back wars of conquest and retaliation. It's not good. Just doesn't work out. And so for more than 100 years, 106 years, or whatever, there has been the world order, to the extent that it's rough, has been moving towards the idea that it's not okay to steal other people's stuff. You shouldn't do that anymore. Yeah, people did that through all human history, but not the last 100 years. And instead, there was the suggestion that President Trump made in in 2016 when he was running for office that, well, if we won in Iraq, why don't we get their oil? Why can't we have their stuff? Or, there's parallels now, too, with that sort of idea that we should win something when we win something. And actually, what we're really trying to do is win peace. So I think that is the larger problem, is the kind of giving a green light to Putin, obviously, and Xi Jinping to some extent, too. This idea of well, maybe it's okay if we just have a world order in which, the big powers get stuff and everybody else is out of luck. And that's really not, I think, what we really want. I don't think it's advisable at all. So I guess that would be, if I were in a position to try to make this argument, I would try to say, let's go back and let's see what we were aiming for, even if we didn't always get it. What are we aiming for and what are we aiming for now? And it's not a transactional view of history where we get stuff. Because actually the pie grows much bigger when countries are not battling each other to the death.
Mark?
Briefly, I think that Trump, one of Trump's most impressive political insights going back to 2016 was that there was this widening gap between where the American people stood and the commitments that the United States had internationally. And it's really remarkable, I think, when we go back to 2016 to see how nobody else was really seeing that and how profound that observation really was. I think, different question, but when we look back on Trump years down the road, we may not like what we see, but I think we'll have to give him his due in seeing, what was happening at sort of the grassroots level in many parts of the United States. So, I think he's onto something in realizing that, as you say, something really significant has to change to bring the commitments into closer alignment with the actual capabilities and the will of the American people ultimately. But if I were the advisor, I would make many of the same points about the incredible benefits, even in sort of raw economic terms, right? That should be, in some ways, be speaking Donald Trump's language, that have come through alliances, right? The enormous benefits have come through a mindset that saw the world not in zero-sum terms, but as a collaborative space where lots of great things could be accomplished with like-minded partners.
Yeah.
Could I just quickly add?
Sure.
Barbara Tuchman wrote a book about, many books, of course, wonderful books, about the proud tower that preceded World War I. The whole structure of European society and culture and institutions and so on. And I think, really, you could talk about what you discussed so wonderfully tonight, that all these multilateral institutions and rules of law that began really in the late 19th century, but mushroomed after World War I, and particularly after World War II, that multilateral, global, institutional, and sort of rule of law, it was amazing for its time. We're going to look back at this, and future historians are going to look at this, and they're going to wonder at what was accomplished during that period. And to trash that proud tower, that great accomplishment of the United States period of rule, and when you think about it in world history, it's a very relatively short time.
Yeah.
Is a very serious matter, and something that I do not believe, if I were a hard-hearted American realist of the most, I just don't believe it's in our interest, remotely in our interest. We need and use and have benefited from and could continue to benefit from, even if they had to be somewhat reformed, international system, because it's in pretty disarray anyway, but it's the best we got.
All right. Yeah, go ahead.
Last thing I would add to that, too, which is that I think an appreciation for what we've built, and that's been hard because historians and politicians, we tend to be very critical and self-critical, running down those accomplishments. Maybe it was all just about global capitalism. What was it all about anyway? Actually, there's really wonderful things that have happened, and we need to talk about those good things and sell those successes so people understand them. But I also think we need to have greater empathy for the sacrifices of some Americans, many Americans who made those accomplishments possible. And so I had this unusual experience. I wrote this book, American Empire, and actually made a film about it that was supported partly by Hoover Institution, by Texas A&M. And the people who called me to say, this is great, were my cousins in Arkansas, who normally never read anything I write, don't call me other than say Merry Christmas. And what they were saying is, why are we doing this sacrifice and other people don't seem to be playing their part? And it was kind of a cri de coeur. It was kind of like, it just doesn't feel good to me. And these are, generous-hearted people. And in fact, if you really great work of Ira Katznelson, what you really learn from that is that it was the American South that voted to keep the United States in World War II. So even as we tend to have these North-South divisions, and these are the people who wonder why we've borne the cost and treasure, and there's not enough acknowledgement of that can't go on forever.
I think it's a really good point about different areas of the country and different cultures within our culture are going to see things differently. Just like some people say, you talk about democracy in America and the rule of law, but we've never had the rule of law for ourselves, as an African-American culture speaking. We've never had the rule of law for ourselves in this country, so we don't see it that way. And I think in this case, we're talking about these international policies, which seem to, or at least can be certainly said, it benefits the elite. They don't, and it's hurt us. And I'm from the Midwest, and I know how it's been hollowed out from an industrial base thing. But you have to kind of say, and it doesn't help only but a little bit, but to say, well, there are now 300 million people in the middle class in China, and 300 million people in the middle class in India that did not exist 40 years ago. And yes, the Midwest got hollowed out by a certain percentage, but it was multiplied in other places. And we need policies that redistribute money to the people who are hollowed out in order for the progress everywhere else. I think that's where we're really missing out on dealing with this issue. Because everybody's paying a price, our whole society, but the whole world is in a totally different place. If you were talking about World War II for a while. If you talk about what the Japanese and the Germans after World War II did, within 15 years, they both had reconstructed their countries with help, and nobody was opposing them and everything. In fact, we're helping them. At least structurally, we were saying we were against them. We gave them some money, but we also gave them the freedom to do it more than anything else, right? And they did, because they were both middle-class societies. And those people wanted their lives back and were willing to work for it. And I think this is the point we're missing. We have now got a world with billions of people in this situation, which is probably our best guarantee against total destructive war, is to have all those people. So that's really something to pay for, something that we need to pay for by redistributing to the people who were hurt partially by that, and to explain it, as you said, to explain what's going on. Yeah. Anyway, so now push yourself. Oh, yeah, go ahead, Mark.
Just to build on that really important point, I think it's so clear that the liberal international order took root in the United States in a period when the welfare state was being built out, when social mobility reached historically high levels in the United States, right? So the bottom line is that more and more people felt an investment in the national mission, but also were realizing benefits in very practical terms in their own lives. And so, given the inequalities that we're all familiar with that have really accelerated in recent years, it's not terribly surprising that dedication to the international system that was once connected to America's prosperity has broken down.
Right. Yeah.
And that, of course, has to do with the resumption of war as well.
Right.
In other words, the peace dividends of the 90s don't come into the 2000s because war resumes on 2001. So those are choices that we made that, have damaged the, folks who don't have as much.
So you're all historians. So let's pretend that it's 50 years from now, all right? And you're teaching. And you've just done your PhDs, and you're about to teach. And you did your PhD on were the changes, the disruption in the early 2020s by the new president, Donald Trump, for the second time. Were the disruptions that he did similar to other disruptions? Even whether, let's ignore the fact, does he have a big plan or does he not have a big plan? He wants to disrupt, right? Were those disruptions the way Genghis Khan's disruptions were, because you can say that was a lot of destruction, but it also created certain civilizations. What is it like? I mean, it's amazing that our favorite people are, Alexander the Great and Julius Caesar and not Genghis Khan, but only because he's not white. Otherwise, we'd say, hey, these guys went through and destroyed, but they also created something. So the question is, in your PhD thesis 50 years from now, how would you analyze what the possibilities are? Was this a good time for some disruption to take place? Anybody want to take a lot, Mark?
I'd love this question, and what I would say is that we may well come to see our current moment as one where a new political order is taking shape in the United States. So in this respect, not with respect to political style or any of the other sort of obvious personality characteristics, I would put Trump alongside FDR and Ronald Reagan as figures who presided over the consolidation of new political coalitions in the United States. For FDR, it was obviously the establishment of the liberal state. Mm-hmm. For Reagan, it was the pushback against that and the emergence of a new coalition that, created a political order that in some ways we've lived in until fairly recently. And I think there's an argument that what the Trump phenomenon really means for us is that a new political order is taking shape. I think the old alignment of the parties around questions of the size of government, the appropriate role that government plays in everyday life, that's still there, but it's giving way, I think, to a more profound division between the parties over really basic issues of the openness or closedness of American society. To what extent are we going to be a cosmopolitan country? To what extent are we going to double down on Christian nationalism? And it could be that 20 or 30 years from now we'll see a new alignment where the big debate in the United States is around those issues. And if that's true, I think the moment that we're passing through right now will be similar to some of these other moments that we can see in retrospect really brought into being new, very basic political orders.
Go ahead, Elizabeth. Yeah.
I'm not as sanguine about that. I think the thing about historians, we don't have crystal balls, so we don't know. I mean, it's amazing how things turn around in ways we don't ever expected. So I do think that that this shakeup has been coming. I mean, I heard it first from my cousins in Arkansas. It wasn't about Trump. So I think that there is some fundamental rejiggering. I remember when Brexit happened, I thought, oh my God, the end of the European Union. And actually, it's kind of a non-event. It's not a great event for Great Britain, but it hasn't really ended the European Union. So sometimes things can change in big ways that then later you look back on and it's just a swell that kind of comes down and retreats. The big problem for me with the way that it's currently unfolding is the encouraging of political violence. We've not had a president in 41, however the math is, all the 2.5 centuries who has encouraged violence against the American state. And we have had that with Donald Trump. So that's to me very profound. The other thing is we've also never had a president who encouraged, I would say, violence against women. And I know it's kind of an interesting thing. Women's rights are the canary in the coal mine, and that's true in many societies. And one of the things, the United States is not alone in this at all, but one of the things we've seen in the last 30, 40 years is the idea of withdrawing rights for women as a global phenomenon, beginning, of course, in the Middle East, but in China, as well as in Russia and in the United States now, and in other countries as well. And I think that there's just a profound turning away from these basic liberal principles of rule of law, which means you don't encourage political violence against your enemies, rule of law, and personal freedoms, which women have benefited from hugely as a group which had the least personal freedoms globally in the last couple thousand years. So these are very profound turns that actually make me less sanguine, I think, than Mark about what this means. I think it's very serious.
Yeah, I can see the perspective that some real shaking up can create a real effort to rethink where we are and where we ought to be. And that out of that could come some very good things. Overall, though, I am not the least bit sanguine. And part of it really is, at one point in your writing up for this thing, you mentioned that the enemy today is not communism anymore. In fact, it's pretty hard to find a genuine communist anywhere. They're all capitalists now. They're all, making their money. But what we've got is authoritarianism. And what we've got is seems to me, a real trend in that direction. Now, maybe I'm just pessimist. I'm not really a pessimist by nature, but I am pretty gloomy right now. And I think when you have the United States in a position here of lining up and being friendly with some of the worst authoritarians in this world, and even little petty people like Orban. You know, what bother with him? You know, he's just, because of a strange constitution, he has a little bit of power in the European Union. But I mean, Hungary's the size of New Jersey. You know, that's exactly. But it's that worries me, and also the fact that these are all people who are really into the use of force. China's rattling the saber. Putin just can't wait. Maybe he's thinking a little bit secondarily about that now, but this is a time, it's a very dangerous time in the world. If we suddenly have massive changes going on in Asia and big moves in Europe, with the United States in the state it's in right at this particular moment, I fear for the future. I am so hoping that I am wrong, really, and I hope no one's getting any sense of me here as a partisan, because really my approach is really, I think, from my own point of view, I do look in the mirror, I feel patriotic. I'm a patriotic American, and I'm patriotic about the things we've done, and I'm understanding about the things that we've done poorly. But I just think this is a very, very difficult time, and I fear for my country, and I fear for the world.
Can I just say,
go ahead, Mark.
I don't disagree for a second. I certainly didn't mean to convey a sort of optimistic
Yeah, no, I understand.
viewpoint about what's coming down the road. I think in some ways, what I tried to articulate, maybe not very well, is a super gloomy thought about the future, that the issues that Trump has put on the table and capitalized on so successfully in political terms are not going anywhere. Right. And those are going to be the ones that shape how both parties behave, I think, going forward. There is that view out there that Trumpism is largely linked to Trump himself, what happens when he's no longer part of the scene, and reasonable people can disagree about that. My own sense is that the issues will persist for whoever comes next as leaders of both parties.
No. It seems to me that he's in a situation where he wants things to change, and the way that he can change them is in the usual authoritarian way, and he has a lot of support for doing that. And if you look back at history, being historians, if you say 95% of all human institutions for the last 5,000 years have certainly been run like the mafia has been run, that kind of authoritarian behavior. So we have another example of this. Now, I think we're either going to know we want to go back to that because we're afraid in this world, or do we have enough confidence to keep trying this democracy experiment that's been going along? So it seems very reasonable for both sides, in my opinion, to be coming up with their reactions to the situation. Your Arkansas cousins, everything. It all depends upon what your personal situation is. I think it's perfectly reasonable for African Americans to say there's never been rule of law in America. So it hasn't applied to us. We understand that you guys have had it, but not us. That to me, even I don't think it's totally accurate, but it's close enough to being accurate that that's a reasonable position to take. So there's that. But that's one of the things that I wrote about this a little while ago was, during humanity's transition to democracy, let he who is without authoritarianism cast the first drone.
That's great.
All right. Another couple of questions. Goldwater versus Johnson. Johnson versus McCarthy. Humphrey versus Nixon. McGovern versus Nixon. Not solely limited to binary choices, which political leaders or leaders have best addressed difficult choices during the Vietnam War? Which one do you think took on the difficult issues the best? Whether they were in power or not, obviously, that's the... Do you think anybody...
Is that the whole list we can draw from?
Oh, you draw from any list you want to during the Vietnam War. Which one do you think took on the difficult issues the best? What, Mark?
Eisenhower.
Eisenhower.
Of the presidents, yeah, without question. I think he was and a couple other presidents had this going for them to a limited degree as well, able to pull something off that I think you were talking about in your discussion of credibility. They were able to talk a politically successful kind of language about the mission of the United States, and yet they also retained the ability to act in rational ways that stopped short of fulfilling the grandest statements that they were very comfortable making. So I think sometimes we should be careful not to be deceived by what presidents say about, their grand plans for the world. Some of them don't actually, if you look at the record, JFK, I think, is a classic example, don't go as far as their rhetoric would suggest. And I think Eisenhower is particularly skilled at saying the right things to win enormous political popularity, but also retaining the ability, when push came to shove in Geneva, Dien Bien Phu, and not intervening, right? Yes, he made decisions to commit the United States to South Vietnam. There's no question he's part of that story of escalation. But he didn't commit ground troops, right? He didn't make the kinds of decisions that we would probably take LBJ in particular to task for. I think there was a sense of moderation, a sense of proportion that McNamara urged as part of his lessons that stand out in his performance with respect to Vietnam.
Yeah, I mean, I would perhaps go in that direction. I mean, it is hard because it was a process of escalation, and we know what escalation does. Escalation, retaliation. So what Eisenhower was dealing with was also not what Johnson was dealing with, and the emergence of Les One versus Ho Chi Minh. I mean, who you're playing with on the other side is part of the challenge. I mean, certainly of all of the men who were those 5 presidents, there was only one who was a serving general in World War II and understood how war actually works, as well as an elected leader. So, he was very deft. At the same time, he moved us in the direction of mutual assured destruction. So there's that. It's a very mixed bag. All of them were in very difficult positions. But I agree, he was very subtle. And in that, and more so subtle that people would say, was it the bland leading the bland? Criticism of Eisenhower is just being too chill, if it were playing golf too much, but it was actually quite clever.
Was he in the news every day? No, it was too bland.
I don't think so. Yeah, you're right.
He had a great ability to bring people together. I think
Yeah,
he
yeah.
needed to, and that was his wartime skill.
Right.
Yeah.
Of course, he was very good at that. And he had a way of being quite sincere, very hard not to like him. And he really had that particular charm. But I would just point to your point. I think Hubert Humphrey in his day, quietly, not so much in the public, but privately, was quite trying to be exceedingly helpful. And in his time. And others quietly behind the scenes pressing Johnson to do the right thing. But he wasn't listening. And yet you think about him, the Great Society was a pretty darn good thing. Here was a big domestic accomplishment. So there it is.
Yeah,
All right.
absolutely.
Lots of very good questions from the audience. We're running out of time. But I will keep them all for Friday. We'll have 3 more speakers on Friday, as I said. And so I'll ask more of your questions then. But we'll finish with one question here. Ken Burns showed the string of corrupted leaders in South Vietnam, supported by the American war. Wouldn't the right moral decision have been to walk away from those corrupt leaders? Yes or no is easy now.
Probably no.
Yeah.
I mean, Chiang Kai-shek in Taiwan wasn't, a great guy, and
Right.
there was Syngman Rhee, and as I said, Washin Nazis. Nobody wanted to cooperate with Winston Churchill because he was an imperialist. In other words, if you tried to pick people out, there were no happy allies. Stalin was our ally in World War II.
Right.
So I think that's a little bit of a fool's errand to think, we could have just walked away from these, characters we don't like. It's almost never worked that way.
Yeah, we'd have to walk off the planet.
Yeah, not too many other options. Yeah, you mentioned the democracies earlier. You know, there was just your little coda on this one. The political scientists in my field, in international relations, were used to had a theory that had its moment, which was that democracies don't fight other democracies. There's one thing they did learn about all their crunching of numbers about wars and so on. The only problem with that one, of course, was that it was a very small N theory.
Yeah.
How many democracies, as opposed to that mountain of data on authoritarians. Some of which didn't fight other authoritarians either. You know, so democracies are an endangered breed.
Well, it's like during the Gulf War, the second one, you know, when the French didn't give us any money, and all this anti-French stuff went around the internet, and I saw one said, you know, the French don't even know how to fight anyway. We had to save them in World War II. We had to save them in World War I. You know, they lost to the Prussians, then they lost to the Indians, and they skipped right over Napoleon. And I was like, excuse me, but, you know, Napoleon did all right. I mean, he lost. But the French, you know, it's like that's the same thing with democracies, because the Civil War in the United States was between two democracies. That was a pretty big war. So that kind of undercuts that theory pretty easily. Okay, so first of all, thank you very much. That was excellent. That was even better than I was expecting.